I was framed at work and fired. Because of this, one manager got divorced, another ended up in jail, and several employees were deported. This will be a long story, but if you read it to the end, you'll find out how I was set up and fired, and how this accidentally triggered a chain reaction that led to a complete shakeup. Some were relocated to other restaurants. The general manager was fired and divorced from his wife. Another manager became the subject of an FBI investigation and was eventually arrested, while several employees were deported. So let's begin. I worked at a luxury restaurant owned by a large corporation that operated multiple restaurant brands. I worked there for about 3.5 years before I was fired, but more on that later. First, I want to explain the role I played in this establishment. I had a lot of responsibilities. From day one, I tried to learn as much as possible about every aspect of the job. I was very persistent in communicating with management. Whenever I wanted to learn about the work processes of a particular department, I dove right in. I started as a waiter but gradually learned various roles, working with takeout orders, hostess duties, bartending, helping bartenders, catering banquets, and deliveries. My main goal at this job was to take as many shifts as possible. I was paid about $12 an hour, although this amount varied if I worked as a bartender or waiter and received tips. Eventually, management noticed that I was a perfect fit for a leadership role. I did so well that they decided to try me as an unofficial supervisor for the team handling takeout orders, catering, and deliveries, as all of these areas fell under the same responsibility zone. I realized that this would eventually lead to a reduction in my work hours since I'd now be involved in just one department. So, I negotiated a pay raise of about $1.50 per hour due to my additional responsibilities. Management considered this increase fair. I wasn't trying to make as much money as possible. I just wanted to cover my monthly bills and save a little for entertainment. I lived in Chicago, which was expensive. I had a pet I had brought with me to the city, which added extra expenses. Soon after I became an unofficial supervisor, I got a girlfriend, and I started going to cafes more often and spending money on her. Thanks to my salary and smart budgeting, I could afford all this. Money wasn't a problem, but there was high staff turnover in management. As a result, new managers often didn't understand what our department did or how important work hours were for employees. Soon, we learned that our current general manager was about to be fired and replaced. The new general manager was considered a rock star when it came to improving restaurants. We Googled his name, and the first result wasn't a glowing review of his work ethic or his outstanding optimization skills. Instead, it was a police booking photo and a report of multiple instances of domestic violence. This is important for the story. Let's call him Harvey. Shortly after Harvey began making changes, one of our best managers resigned. She refused to work with him and, like a damn prophet, predicted a wave of harassment, sexist comments, and the inevitable destruction of our restaurant. Soon after her departure, our new general manager started replacing existing managers with people he had previously worked with. Eventually, all the managers were replaced except for one kitchen manager. Let's call him Fred. Fred had been working there since I started. He was like a chameleon. His values and ethics changed depending on who his boss was. Honestly, I somewhat admired his survival instincts, but ultimately, I thought of him as a sycophant and a traitor. Harvey never appointed a manager for our department, so we were left to work mostly unsupervised. Aside from me acting as a supervisor, no one breathed down our necks or nitpicked every little thing. While there were minor issues in our department, everything functioned relatively smoothly overall. Since we didn't have our own manager, we often had to call someone from the leadership team to handle tasks requiring a manager's card for confirmation. Usually, Fred handled these calls, as the kitchen was closest to our department. Over time, the new management team started seeing Fred as our de facto leader. However, the regular employees still saw me as their supervisor. This meant that every time Fred tried to implement changes that could harm us, the team relied on me to smooth things over and keep things running as they were, because our system had already proven effective. For several months, Fred and I clashed dozens of times. We constantly argued about the importance of work hours for our department employees. Fred was convinced we should be making money primarily from tips, like servers. However, most of our orders were processed through the Grubhub online platform, which didn't allow customers to leave tips. As a result, we earned very little. We didn't have many deliveries each day, and the tips from them amounted to a maximum of $10. Splitting $10 among 4 people was practically nothing. This only proved that Fred had no idea what he was talking about. Eventually, we had a meeting with Harvey, Fred, and all the employees in our department. We were given the chance to voice all our complaints and concerns about the proposed changes without fear of consequences, and the staff took full advantage of it. They spoke about how Fred was trying to cut their hours even though he wasn't officially our manager. When the subject of hiring someone for this position came up, the team suggested my candidacy. After all, I had already been effectively fulfilling the supervisor's duties for several months. Additionally, management often consulted me when creating schedules since I knew which days employees could or couldn't work due to school or family obligations. At that moment, when this was mentioned, I noticed Harvey and Fred exchange a glance. I realized they had already decided to get rid of me. They didn't say anything, but their looks told me that my days at this job were numbered, and they would find a way to fire me sooner or later. We were given a lot of promises during that meeting. They assured us they wouldn't cut hours anymore. Management stated they would stop sending everyone home and leaving one person to close. Our department wasn't small, and it was simply impossible for one person to complete all the cleaning and close the shift according to sanitation and safety standards. They promised that everyone would work their scheduled hours. We didn't demand the impossible. We simply said that our department typically needed 3 to 4 people. We agreed they could send 2 people home early, but there should always be at least 2 employees remaining to close. We were promised this would be the case. However, just a week later, the manager started sending everyone home again every evening except for one person. One day, they tried to do this when I was closing. We had just returned from a major catering event, and the workload for one person was overwhelming. When Fred came in and tried to send everyone home except for me, I stood up to him. I told him that he was systematically breaking the promise he had made to us during that meeting. He looked me straight in the eye and told me to stop complaining. He added that if I kept telling him how to do his job, he could easily find someone to replace me. I quickly realized this was an attempt to frame me. He wanted me to keep arguing and do something he could use against me. So, I backed off and started cleaning. In the end, I had to stay late, which meant overtime that had to be paid at a higher rate. For this, I received a reprimand because overtime wasn't allowed without a manager's approval. When I refused to sign the reprimand, pointing out that I had warned Fred in advance that it was impossible to finish all the cleaning alone within the regular hours, they allowed me not to sign it. This only happened because the HR representative present wasn't one of Harvey's loyal followers. Now, let's jump to the day I was fired. It's important to note that I always arrived at work an hour early. Living in Chicago was expensive, and food wasn't cheap. However, we were allowed to eat unlimited soup and bread at work for free. So, I would come early to grab a bite before my shift. On that day, when I went into the kitchen for soup, one of the cooks told me he had a dish that had been canceled and that Fred had instructed him to give it to someone. The cook assured me that Fred had already written it off, and it was free to take. Coincidentally, it was my favorite appetizer, so I happily took it. I had just sat down at my booth when Harvey and Fred approached me. They asked if I had placed an order for that dish. I explained that the cook had given it to me, saying it was a canceled order already written off by Fred. Fred acted as if he was hearing about this for the first time and said he had no idea what I was talking about. Harvey then declared, "I think you understand this is theft. Finish your meal, then pack your things and leave. This is your last meal here." I tried to explain that the dish was given to me by the cook, but they refused to listen. I then suggested we go to the kitchen together to talk to the cook. However, by the time we got there, he had already gone home. I had no choice but to gather my belongings, say goodbye to my colleagues, and leave. On my way out, I told the staff in our department what had happened and described the situation as it was. They were shocked and angry, but above all, they were saddened to see me go. As I was heading out, I decided to stop by the accounting office to collect any tips that might have accumulated for me during the week. I wanted to make sure I wouldn't be cheated out of that money. Before entering, I had a strong hunch and turned on my phone's recording function, placing it in my pocket. Although the video only captured a black screen due to the camera being covered by fabric, the recording picked up muffled voices. From behind the door, I overheard Harvey and Fred discussing how everything had gone according to plan, and how they had been trying to get rid of me since the meeting with my department. I knocked on the door, and they immediately fell silent. They asked what I was doing there, and I replied that I had come for my tips. They took the money from the safe and handed it to me. Despite the boiling anger inside me from what I had heard, I decided not to burn bridges just yet, hoping to address the situation later. I shook hands with both managers, thanked them for the opportunity to work there, and left. Before leaving, I made sure to pull out my phone and record the restaurant's facade with its name and logo. Working in a restaurant teaches you always to cover your back. This rule applies to many industries, but something told me this recording would come in handy later. If I was accused of theft, I wanted to be able to prove my innocence, especially if it came up during future job interviews, which, as it turned out, it did. On my way home on the train, I sent out a few messages and posted in local Facebook groups, announcing that I had just been fired and was urgently looking for a new job. By the time I reached my station, I already had an interview scheduled for the same day. About 5 minutes into the interview, they offered me the job. However, after discussing the details, I realized it wasn't a good fit and declined. I went through several more interviews before finding a position that was perfect for me, with a significant salary increase compared to my previous job. Most importantly, I wouldn't have to deal with customers anymore. It was an auditor position at a logistics company. During the interview, the manager, whom we'll call Dean, mentioned that he had already called my previous workplace and spoken with the general manager, Harvey. Harvey told him that I had been fired for theft. Fortunately, Dean asked me to share my side of the story and allowed me to take out my phone and show him the recording. I asked if the voice on the recording matched the one he had heard on the phone. He confirmed it did. That was enough for him to believe the recording was genuine. He listened as the two managers on the recording admitted to framing me. Then he watched until the end, where I filmed the restaurant's facade with its name and logo. Dean immediately hired me and asked me to send him the recording, which I did. I thought that would be the end of it. About 7 months later, when I was already well settled in my new job, HR sent out an email welcoming new employees. It included a list of new hires, interesting facts about them, and their photos. Such emails were sent every time a new group of employees joined. Among the new faces was Thomas, a former colleague from the restaurant. We had worked together at the host stand, and I was glad to see a familiar face on the team. I found his workstation, greeted him, and asked why he had left the restaurant. It turned out he hadn't left voluntarily. He had been laid off because the company was under investigation. Everything started with a seemingly minor incident. The corporation owning the restaurant chain received a letter with my recording attached. That was enough for corporate leadership to send an auditor to conduct an internal investigation. Thomas was surprised that I knew nothing about this, as, according to him, they had tried to contact me multiple times. Hearing this, I checked the old email account I had used when applying for the restaurant job. There were at least 24 emails asking me to come in and discuss my dismissal. Since I had also changed my phone number, they couldn't reach me directly. Thomas continued his story. Before the corporate auditor arrived, Harvey and Fred had tried to strike a deal with my department. They offered the staff a small pay raise if they agreed to tell the auditor that I was incompetent and unable to handle my duties. On the day the auditor arrived, there was a small exodus from my former department. Several employees quit on the spot, right in front of the corporate representative, a woman we'll call Audrey. Before leaving, they didn't miss the chance to expose Harvey and Fred completely. That was the first blow to both of them. The second blow came a few days later, when Audrey showed Harvey and Fred the recording that had started it all. They vehemently denied the accusations, but Harvey's voice was unmistakable. It was too unique to confuse with anyone else. Moreover, the recording captured our voices as we shook hands and said friendly goodbyes. Harvey and Fred even bragged to Audrey about this moment, thinking it would paint them in a positive light, as if we parted on good terms. But that wasn't the second blow just yet. That came when it became clear they needed to be separated. Audrey reassigned Fred to another restaurant owned by the parent company, while Harvey was temporarily demoted. This was a real test for them. They had been an inseparable duo, acting in a coordinated and cynical manner. But the pressure of the investigation cracked their partnership. They publicly quarreled on the restaurant's Facebook page. Although the post was deleted, Thomas managed to see it. It featured a photo where Fred appeared, despite his reassignment to another restaurant. Harvey left a passive-aggressive comment saying Fred shouldn't have been in the photo because he'd been transferred due to misconduct. Fred responded with something along the lines of, "At least when you Google my name, no stories about me hitting my wife come up." To this, Harvey replied, "Funny to hear that from someone who's cheating on his wife with Janet's sister." Janet's name has been changed. Janet was appointed as the official supervisor of my former department after my dismissal. Fred clapped back, "Hilarious to hear that from someone who's slept with half the waitresses. Each one has her own story about your attempts to seduce them." The post was deleted, but Audrey saw it. That was the second blow. The third blow came the next day, when Audrey began interviewing the waitstaff and bartenders, one by one, separately. Many of them shared similar stories. Those who confirmed Harvey's inappropriate behavior said he had offered to be their sugar daddy or sponsor in exchange for intimate photos or special after-hours meetings at the restaurant. Harvey was fired. But that wasn't the worst part for him. Audrey wasn't just a random corporate representative. She had previously been the regional manager for this area and had personally hired Harvey's wife as the general manager of another restaurant in the city. Audrey called the restaurant where Harvey's wife worked and told her everything she had learned from the waitstaff. Later, we found out that they divorced. She had already given him a second chance after he had beaten her. I don't know what made her forgive him for that, but he definitely didn't get a third chance. After Harvey was fired, Audrey interrogated the same cook who had given me the dish on the day I was fired. I don't know how it came up, but at some point, he admitted he was an undocumented immigrant. Audrey, holding his personnel file with a social security number and Illinois state ID, was puzzled by this revelation and pressed him for an explanation. It turned out Fred had connections and had been running something akin to a black market for fake documents. He supplied undocumented immigrants with forged social security cards and state IDs so they could be hired at lower wages. This scheme had been operating for at least 4 years. Clearly, this was a criminal offense. With potential legal repercussions looming, Audrey had no choice but to report it to the authorities. Local police sought the help of the FBI, as some evidence fell outside their jurisdiction. Fred was arrested and quickly started naming people to whom he had sold fake documents. I don't know if he named all of them, but he identified about 14 individuals. Out of those 14, at least half were deported, including the cook who had given me the dish on the day of my firing. Thomas continued explaining that this entire chain of events began with my dismissal. However, I never sent that recording to the corporate office. I only gave it to Dean when he hired me. I asked how, then, the recording ended up with the corporation. Thomas revealed that Dean had forwarded it to his wife, who happened to be a lawyer. He wanted to find out if I had grounds to sue my former workplace because what they did to me was blatantly wrong. Dean also remembered our first conversation, during which I mentioned that I wasn't the kind of person who would try to make millions off the mistakes of two idiots. But I also said it would be incredibly satisfying to see them lose their jobs. It was Dean's wife who sent the recording to the legal department at the headquarters of my former company. Dean and his wife simply wanted to ensure the two scumbags who wronged me would face consequences. But instead, they tugged at a string that turned out to be so long it set off a chain reaction of events: accusations of workplace harassment, revelations of managers cheating on their wives with women they themselves had promoted, a divorce, mass staff changes, an FBI investigation into a black market for fake documents, and at least 6 deportations, possibly up to 14. I'm not sure if this can be called nuclear revenge since I didn't actively pursue it. But Thomas made it clear that even if it wasn't revenge in the classic sense, it was definitely a nuclear event, leaving behind an enormous crater. Well, that's the end of the story.